Okay, so you're here because you really need to get a grip on how to efficiently manage your virtual IT infrastructure, right? And today we're going deep on Microsoft's Hyper-V Manager.
Okay.
And I think this is really going to give you a direct path to understanding all those best practices for optimizing your virtual machines.
Right.
Um, so really just think of this as a way to get all of the best information on how to make your Hyper-V environment really sing,
Yeah.
really get the most out of it.
For sure. And our goal today really is just to kind of extract the core strategies that are out there for
Sure.
building a really, really optimized virtual infrastructure.
Yeah.
And we're going to use Hyper-V Manager as our central tool here.
Okay.
So we've gone through all the information. We've kind of sifted through it, and we're going to highlight what we think are the absolute must-knows to get the most out of your virtual environment.
So for our listeners who might be a little newer to all of this, what exactly is Hyper-V Manager?
Sure. So Hyper-V Manager is a Microsoft-provided tool, and it has this really nice user-friendly graphical interface,
Okay.
a GUI, that lets you manage your Hyper-V hosts and all the virtual machines that are running on them.
Right.
And it's really your command center for everything you do in terms of creating your virtual machines, configuring them, and then keeping an eye on them.
Okay, so it really is that central point that you're going to go to do all of the things that you need to do.
Yeah, you've got it.
To keep things running.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's dive into the Hyper-V best practices, and I think it all starts with resource allocation.
Yeah, resource allocation is kind of an amazing thing because it's so fundamental and so important.
Right.
And you really need to think about this right from the get-go.
Yeah.
I mean, when you're setting up your virtual environment, you really need to think carefully about the CPU memory and storage.
Yeah.
And if you don't get this right, you're almost certainly going to run into all kinds of performance bottlenecks. And these bottlenecks can ripple across your whole virtual infrastructure and affect everything.
Right.
And the best way to think about this is that not all virtual machines are created equal.
Right.
So, for example, you might have a web server, and that web server might thrive with more CPU cores, but less RAM dedicated to it.
Right.
But if you have a database server, that's usually something that demands lots of RAM.
Got it.
So it really depends on the workload. And it's really a mistake to kind of treat all VMs the same because you can really end up with a lot of wasted resources and some sluggish performance where you really need the performance to be good.
So it's not just about like throwing as much processing power or memory at it as possible. You really do need to be strategic about how you are allocating those resources to the different virtual machines.
Exactly. And it's about matching those resources to the workload. I mean, if you overcommit to a VM, and what I mean by overcommit is if you assign more resources to it than your physical hardware actually has.
You're going to see those VMs really fighting over very limited resources.
Right.
And your performance is going to suffer.
It's like too many cars trying to get down a one-lane road.
Yeah, it's a great analogy.
Everyone's trying to cram in.
Exactly.
And no one's going anywhere fast.
Yeah, and when you think about storage,
Yeah.
it's not just about having enough space.
Okay.
If you have VMs that handle a lot of read and write operations, like databases,
Right.
Using something like a high-performance SSD can really improve their responsiveness.
So it's about having the right tool for the right job.
Exactly. And it's about aligning the speed of your storage with the demands of your applications.
Okay.
So think of it as giving your VMs that need it a really super fast pipeline for all the data.
Okay, so that makes sense.
Yeah.
And all of this really does come back to planning, doesn't it?
Yeah, planning is key. You need to really understand what each of those workloads is going to require to kind of architect that environment where everything's going to run smoothly.
Yeah.
But, there's a really cool feature that can help with all of this.
Yeah.
And it's called dynamic memory.
Dynamic memory.
Can you tell us a little bit more about how that works?
Yeah, dynamic memory is really, really cool.
Okay.
Instead of permanently assigning a fixed amount of RAM to a VM, the hypervisor can actually adjust it dynamically.
Okay.
Based on the needs of the VM in real time.
Right. Okay. So if it needs more, it can get more.
Exactly.
If it doesn't need as much, it can give some back, and then other virtual machines can use it.
That's exactly how it works.
Okay.
So it's very efficient.
Right.
And it's a much better way to utilize your overall memory resources.
Okay, so how do we actually put dynamic memory to work?
Well, within the settings of your virtual machine,
okay,
you'll see there's an option to enable dynamic memory. And once you do that, The system will manage that memory within the boundaries that you set.
Okay.
And the boundaries are the minimum and the maximum.
Okay.
And that brings us to something really important, and that is you need to monitor your memory usage.
Yeah.
And set those thresholds appropriately.
Because the last thing you want is one virtual machine hogging all of the memory and then all the others are struggling.
Exactly. You don't want one VM to starve all the others.
Right.
So it's really important to keep an eye on how your VMs are using memory.
Okay.
Dynamic memory is a great tool.
Yeah.
But you still have to establish some sensible limits.
Yeah.
Both a minimum and a maximum.
Right.
The minimum ensures that your VM will always have enough to operate effectively.
Yep.
And the maximum prevents it from taking so much
that
it actually impacts other VMs that are on the same host.
So it's that balancing act again.
It's all about balance.
Yeah, making sure everything has enough to run, but you're not letting one take everything.
Exactly.
Okay, well, let's
Now let's switch gears a little bit.
Yeah.
And let's talk about something that's really, really vital, and that is network configuration.
Right, because if your virtual environment can't talk to the rest of the network, then it's not going to do much good.
Exactly. The network is like the lifeblood of any virtual environment.
Yeah.
If you don't configure your network, right?
Yeah.
You are going to run into all sorts of performance and security issues.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So?
Okay, so where do we begin with optimizing our virtual network?
Okay, so the fundamental building block
Okay.
of virtual networking in Hyper-V is called the virtual switch.
Okay.
And the key thing to understand here
Yeah.
is that this virtual switch is a software-defined component
Okay.
that lets you manage the flow of all the traffic
Right.
between your VMs and the physical network infrastructure.
Okay.
So it's really the central point,
Okay.
both for segmenting and controlling all that traffic.
Right.
There are different types of virtual switches in Hyper-V. You can have an external switch, which binds to your physical network adapter.
Okay.
And this lets your VMs communicate with the outside world.
Okay.
But then you can also have an internal switch,
Uh-huh.
which creates a network that's only accessible to the VMs on that host and the host itself.
Okay.
And this can be really useful for isolated testing environments where you don't want anything to get in or out.
Right. Just got it contained within itself.
Exactly. So it's kind of like a sophisticated virtual traffic management system.
Yeah. It's a good way to think about it.
Yeah.
All right. So then building on top of that virtual switch.
Right. So once you have your virtual switch, you can then implement things like VLANs,
Okay.
which are virtual local area networks,
Okay.
and other network isolation techniques.
Okay.
And if we kind of think about the big picture here,
Yeah.
what this lets you do is logically separate different types of traffic.
Okay.
So you might want to isolate your production environment,
Right.
your development environment.
Got it.
And not only does this improve security,
Mhm.
because it limits the impact of any kind of security breach, but it can also improve performance because you're reducing a lot of the unnecessary broadcast traffic.
Right. So you're keeping things contained and running smoothly.
Exactly.
So then what about the individual virtual machines themselves?
Right.
So are there specific network settings that we should be paying attention to within each VM's configuration?
Yes, definitely. So within each virtual machine's network adapter settings,
Okay.
you have options to really fine-tune performance.
Okay.
You can do things like bandwidth management,
Uh-huh.
where you might want to limit how much bandwidth a particular VM can consume,
Okay.
or you can enable jumbo frames,
That's
which can improve network efficiency by allowing larger packets of data to be sent.
right.
So the optimal settings here really depend on the needs of the applications that are running on that VM.
Right. And that comes back to that planning that we were talking about at the beginning.
Exactly.
Right. Knowing what your applications need
You got
and what they're going to be doing so you can
Yeah.
fine-tune everything to make sure it runs its best.
Absolutely. Now let's move on to a topic
Okay.
that I think no IT environment can really afford to neglect,
Mm-hmm.
and that is backup and recovery.
Right. Because if you lose all your data, it doesn't matter how well your virtual environment was running.
Exactly.
So this is super important.
This is critical.
So what are the essential things that we need to think about?
Okay, so the absolute essential thing here is to have a well-defined
Okay.
and a consistently executed backup strategy.
Oh.
And this starts with scheduling regular backups.
Okay.
And you really need to think about how critical your data is and how often it changes, and then establish a schedule that makes sense for your requirements.
Right.
And the good news is there are some fantastic tools out there that can automate this whole process.
Okay.
And this really improves reliability because you're not relying on a human to do it.
Right, because humans make mistakes, we forget to do things.
Exactly.
So having it automated just makes it so much more reliable.
Yeah. And creating backups is really just one part of this whole equation.
Okay.
You need to test your restores.
Yeah.
A lot of organizations don't do this.
Right.
They create their backups.
Yeah.
But they never actually go through the process of restoring from the backups.
Right.
And this is critical because you need to make sure that those backups are actually viable.
Right.
And that you can recover your data when you need to.
When that moment comes, you need to be able to actually get that data back.
Exactly. Because the worst thing is to have a data loss.
Right.
And then find out that your backups were corrupted or unusable.
Then you're really in trouble.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So make sure you test those restores, and make sure you test those restores in a representative environment. Because sometimes there are weird compatibility issues that you won't discover until you're actually trying to recover.
Right. And that's not the time to find that out.
No, it's not.
So where should these backups live? Should we just keep them on the same server as everything else?
Well, ideally not.
Right.
So you really want to protect yourself against any kind of local disaster, like a hardware failure or even, physical damage to your site.
Right.
So you should store your backups either off-site or in the cloud.
Right.
And this adds that extra layer of protection.
Yeah.
That's so essential.
That's a good point.
For business continuity.
Okay. So let's talk about another really important thing.
Sure.
Security.
Security is absolutely critical.
Right, because if someone can get into your virtual environment, then they can do a lot of damage.
You got it.
So what do we need to think about here?
You need to think about security in layers.
Yeah.
So first and foremost,
Yeah.
you got to make sure that all of your hosts and all of your virtual machines are patched with the latest security updates.
Right.
These updates very often address known vulnerabilities that could be exploited.
Right.
So you want to think of it as vaccinating your systems against threats.
So patch early and patch often.
Patch early, patch often.
All right.
That should be your mantra.
Okay, good advice.
The second thing is to enable Secure Boot for all of your VMs.
Okay, and Secure Boot, what does that do?
Secure Boot is really cool because what it does is it ensures that only trusted software can run when your VM starts up.
Got it.
So this helps to prevent malware from loading during that boot process before your security software has even had a chance to start up.
So it's like a fundamental first line of defense.
Yeah, it's a really fundamental security measure.
Okay.
Now, the next thing you want to think about is something called role-based access control, or RBAC.
Okay.
And the idea here is least privilege.
Okay.
So you're only giving users the specific permissions that they need to do their jobs and nothing more.
Okay, so they can only access what they absolutely need to access.
Exactly. So this really limits the potential for unauthorized changes or for malicious activity.
Yeah, whether it's on purpose or by accident.
Whether it's intentional or unintentional.
Right.
And then finally, don't overlook network security.
Okay.
So you want to implement firewalls and network security groups to carefully control all the traffic that's flowing to and from your VMs.
Okay.
And you want to make sure that only the ports that are necessary are actually open.
Okay.
And that all the traffic that is flowing is being monitored for suspicious activity.
So it's like minimizing your attack surface everywhere.
Exactly. Minimize, minimize, minimize.
Yeah. So once we have all of that in place, how do we make sure it's working properly and continues to work properly over time?
That's a great question.
I think that's where performance monitoring comes in.
Performance monitoring is key.
Okay.
You need to regularly monitor performance to maintain a healthy and a high-performing virtual environment. Luckily, Hyper-V Manager includes some built-in performance counters that let you track things like CPU utilization, memory usage, disk I/O, and network throughput.
Got it.
And you can look at these both for your hosts and for the individual virtual machines.
So we can see if one particular virtual machine is struggling?
Exactly.
Okay.
By looking at these counters, you can identify bottlenecks or resource constraints before they become huge problems.
Right.
And you can then fine-tune your VM settings, maybe add more memory or CPU,
right.
and then you can optimize that resource utilization.
Okay, so we can really keep things running smoothly.
Exactly. And then to take this to the next level,
yeah.
there are automated monitoring tools that can send you alerts and reports on the overall health of your VMs.
Right.
So you can fix problems before anyone even notices.
Right. So it's all about being proactive.
Proactive is the key.
Okay. Now let's talk about something that I think is so important, but a lot of times doesn't get a lot of attention.
Yeah.
And that is documentation.
Documentation.
Why is documentation so important?
Documentation is the unsung hero of IT.
Right.
You might not always be the one managing this environment.
Right.
Or you might need to troubleshoot a problem 6 months from now, a year from now, even years down the road.
Right.
Documentation is your organization's collective memory for your virtual infrastructure.
Right.
So you need to document everything, what resources are allocated, the network settings, what applications are running, what the purpose of that VM is.
Yeah, it's like having that blueprint that you can always go back to and see how things were set up.
Exactly.
All right, so then in addition to just like the general setup and the configuration of each virtual machine, what else should we be documenting?
Yeah, you also want to keep a change log. You want to record every modification that you make. So any VM updates, software installations, changes to backup schedules.
Got it.
This is so valuable when it comes to troubleshooting problems.
Okay.
And it's also good for auditing.
Right.
And then finally, you should develop and maintain what are called standard operating procedures, or SOPs, for all the common VM management tasks. So that you ensure consistency and reliability, especially if multiple people are managing this environment.
So everyone's following the same playbook.
Exactly. Everybody's on the same page.
Okay, so let's move on now and talk about some of the more advanced things.
Yeah, let's dive into some of those advanced features
that Hyper-V Manager offers.
All right, so one that's particularly useful is checkpoints.
Okay.
You may also hear these referred to as snapshots.
Okay.
But checkpoints is the more common term now.
Got it.
So a checkpoint captures the entire state of a virtual machine at a particular moment in time.
All right.
So everything that's in memory, the data on the virtual disks, the hardware configuration, it's all captured in that checkpoint.
So it's like taking a really, really detailed snapshot.
Exactly. It's like hitting pause on that virtual machine.
So if something goes wrong, we can go back to that moment in time.
Exactly. So the main reason for checkpoints is to create this known good state before you make any significant changes.
Right.
So you might be installing new software, applying operating system updates, or making major configuration changes.
Okay.
So you create a checkpoint before you do any of those things.
Got it.
And then if something unexpected happens, you can just revert back to that checkpoint.
And you're back in business.
You're good to go.
All right. But are there any downsides to checkpoints or things we should be careful of?
There are some things to keep in mind.
Okay.
Checkpoints can consume quite a bit of storage space over time. And if you have too many checkpoints or very old checkpoints, it can affect the performance of the VM. So you need to review your checkpoints regularly and delete any that you don't need anymore.
Got it.
And it's also very important to understand that checkpoints are not a long-term backup solution.
Okay.
They're for short-term rollbacks.
Okay.
If you want real data protection, you still need a good backup strategy.
So checkpoints for quick recovery.
Exactly.
And backups for the long-term protection.
You got it.
Okay, so what's another cool feature of Hyper-V Manager?
All right, let's talk about live migration.
Okay.
This is a very powerful feature that lets you move a running VM from one Hyper-V host to another without any downtime.
So the users don't even know that it's happening?
Exactly. It's seamless.
Okay, that's amazing.
So it's great for maintaining uptime.
Right.
So when would you actually use this?
Okay, yeah. When would we use that?
Well, the very common use case is for planned maintenance.
Okay.
So if you need to take a server offline to do upgrades or repairs, you can use live migration to move the VMs off of that server onto another server without interrupting anything.
Right. So you can keep everything running while you're doing your maintenance.
It's also really useful for load balancing.
Okay.
So if one of your hosts is getting overloaded, You can move some of the VMs to a host that's less busy.
Got it.
And this helps to balance things out.
Yeah, and kind of keep everything running at its optimal speed.
Exactly. And finally, live migration can also be really helpful in disaster recovery.
Okay.
So if your primary host fails, you can quickly move your VMs to a healthy host.
And minimize the downtime.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's really about that uptime.
Yeah.
And that resource availability.
Uptime and availability are key.
And just that flexibility to move things around as you need to.
Absolutely.
So are there any requirements for live migration?
Yeah, you need to make sure that your hosts are configured correctly. So you typically need to set up a dedicated network for the migration traffic to keep things fast and secure.
Got it.
And you also usually need shared storage. That both hosts can access.
Right.
But once you have all of that set up,
you
can do it all through Hyper-V Manager.
Okay, fantastic.
Yeah.
So what's our last big feature that we're going to cover?
Okay. The last one is Hyper-V Replica.
Okay.
And this is a built-in disaster recovery solution
Okay.
that lets you replicate a VM from your primary site to a secondary site.
Okay.
And it does this asynchronously.
All right.
Which means it's happening in the background.
Okay.
And it creates this ongoing copy of your VMs.
Right.
So if something bad happens at your main site, you can quickly bring those VMs online.
Right.
At your secondary site.
Got it. So it's like having a backup that's always ready to go.
Exactly. It's a hot standby.
Okay.
So you configure your replication settings for your most critical VMs, tell it where to send those replicas and how often to do it.
Okay.
And then you need to test your failover procedures regularly.
Right.
Because you need to know that you can actually activate those VMs quickly.
In a real emergency.
Exactly. And you also need to have a failback plan. So once your primary site is back up and running, you know how to transition back smoothly.
Because failing over is only half of the story.
You got it.
You got to be able to get back.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's not just about having the VMs available, but knowing how to use them.
Yeah.
How to get back.
Exactly.
When the time comes.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground
We have.
on how to optimize our Hyper-V environment.
Yeah.
So let's talk about how all of this connects to data protection and infrastructure expansion.
All right.
And that's where Stonefly comes in.
Stonefly.
Right. So tell us a little bit about Stonefly.
So Stonefly's been around for a long time. They're a pioneer in storage backup and disaster recovery.
Okay.
Cloud solutions, and even AI and security.
Wow, they really do a lot.
They do a lot, and they're very focused on advanced data services.
Okay.
So they have things like immutable snapshots, which are fantastic against ransomware.
Right.
And they have really strong encryption.
Okay.
Both at rest and in transit.
Got it.
So your data is always secure.
Okay.
They also offer synchronous and asynchronous replication.
Okay.
Intelligent tiering, smart flash cache.
Okay.
And they have patented immutable and air-gapped repositories.
Okay.
So they have a lot of really cool features.
Wow, there's a lot.
And they can manage single node environments.
Okay.
All the way up to 128 nodes across multiple locations.
So for someone listening who's trying to figure out how to protect their Hyper-V environment, or they know they need more storage, how can Stonefly help them specifically?
Stonefly can help in a lot of ways.
Okay.
So if you're looking to improve your data protection, or you need to expand your storage capacity, or you want to boost the performance and scalability of your virtual infrastructure, or you just need to refresh your whole setup. Stonefly has solutions, and they have competitive prices and really great support.
So they have everything you need.
They do.
Okay, so I understand they have some promotions going on right now.
They do.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so they have immutable and air-gapped backup solutions starting at just $10.
Wow, $10. That's really affordable.
Yeah.
Okay.
And they also have a 70 terabyte
okay.
backup and disaster recovery appliance.
Okay.
That's expandable to 4 petabytes.
Wow, 4 petabytes. That's a lot of storage.
It is.
Okay.
And it has air-gapped immutable support for Veeam Rubrik Commvault site recovery.
Okay.
And it has AI with object lockdown to protect you from ransomware.
Right.
All for $700.
That sounds like a great deal.
It's a great deal.
Okay.
And if you're interested, you can contact them at sales@stonefly.com.
Okay, we'll make sure to include that in the show notes.
Okay, great.
Okay, so let's summarize everything we've talked about.
Great.
So the key takeaways here.
Okay.
Efficient resource allocation.
Yes.
Using dynamic memory. Optimizing your network configuration.